Imagine this. It is a sweltering August night in the year 410 after Christ. You are standing on the Aventine Hill, and below you the eternal city burns. Not metaphorically, literally. Flames lick the marble columns of temples that have stood for 800 years. The screams you hear are not from some distant battlefield, but from the streets where your grandparents walked to buy bread. Alaric and his Visigoths have breached the walls. Rome, the city that conquered the known world, the city that called itself eternal, is being sacked for the first time in 8 centuries. And here is what no one tells you. The empire does not end tonight. It will stagger on for another 66 years in the west, and for another 1,000 in the east. But something dies in this moment. Not Rome itself, but the idea that Rome could never fall. The psychological wound is deeper than any physical destruction. Saint Jerome, writing from his monastery in Bethlehem, will weep when he hears the news. The light of the world has been extinguished, he writes. But was it? Or was something else being born in that very darkness? This is the paradox we are going to unravel tonight. The lost age of Rome, that twilight period between the glory of the Caesars and the supposed darkness of the medieval world, is not what you have been taught. It is not a simple story of decline and fall, of barbarians at the gates, of civilization crumbling into ignorance. That narrative is a construction, a useful fiction invented by later generations who needed a villain for their origin story. The truth is far more unsettling and far more beautiful. The lost age of Rome was simultaneously the death of one world and the violent, bloody, magnificent birth of another. It was an age of collapse and creation existing in the same breath. And if you are listening to me now, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world sleeps, you already sense this. You know that endings and beginnings are never clean. You live in an age of your own contradictions, and perhaps that is why this story calls to you. Before we descend deeper into this labyrinth of light and shadow, take a moment. If you are finding value in these nocturnal journeys through time, consider subscribing to this channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an expedition. Leave a comment telling me what time it is where you are, what city, what country. We are a scattered tribe of night wanderers, insomniacs and dreamers spread across every time zone, united by our refusal to accept simple stories. Your engagement keeps this space alive. Your curiosity fuels these explorations. Now, settle into your pillow. Let the darkness of your room merge with the darkness of history, and let us travel together. The Rome you think you know, the Rome of gladiators and emperors, of marble forums and triumphant legions, that Rome was already transforming long before the Visigoths arrived. Picture the city in the year 300. It is still magnificent, still the largest city in the Western world, but something has shifted. The old gods are fading. In the catacombs beneath the city, Christians gather in secret, painting fish symbols on the walls, whispering prayers to a crucified Jew from Palestine. Within a generation, their faith will become the official religion of the empire. Constantine will see a cross in the sky and conquer in its name. The temples of Jupiter and Mars will fall silent, their priesthoods disbanded, their treasures confiscated. This is not decline. This is metamorphosis. The Roman world is not dying. It is shedding its skin. And here is what the textbooks rarely emphasize. This transformation produced some of the most extraordinary intellectual achievements in human history. While the political structure of the Western Empire was fragmenting, The minds within it were synthesizing something unprecedented. Augustine of Hippo, writing in the early 5th century, as the Vandals closed in on his North African city, produced The City of God, a work that would shape Western philosophy for 1,000 years. He was not writing in a vacuum of ignorance. He was drawing on Plato, on Cicero, on the entire tradition of classical thought, and fusing it with Christian theology to create something entirely new. The barbarians were at the gates, and a bishop was inventing the philosophy of history. This is the paradox. This is what they do not tell you. Consider the law. We think of Rome as the source of Western legal tradition, and we are right. But the great codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was not compiled during the golden age of Augustus or Trajan. It was assembled in the 6th century under the Emperor Justinian in Constantinople, while the Western Empire had already ceased to exist. Justinian looked out at a world of Gothic kingdoms and Vandal pirates and decided that the moment was right to organize every legal opinion, every imperial decree, every judicial precedent into a coherent system. This was not the act of a dying civilization. This was the act of a civilization that believed in its own permanence so absolutely that it could afford to spend decades on legal scholarship while enemies pressed on every frontier. The Corpus Juris Civilis would become the foundation of European law. It would be rediscovered in medieval Bologna and spark a legal revolution. The lost age of Rome was writing the rulebook for the next millennium. But let us not romanticize. Let us swing the pendulum to the shadow side, because the shadow was real and it was terrible. The same centuries that produced Augustine and Justinian also produced horrors that defy imagination. The population of Rome itself tells the story. In the 2nd century, at the height of imperial power, the city held perhaps 1 million inhabitants. By the 6th century, after waves of siege, plague, and economic collapse, that number had fallen to perhaps 30,000. 30,000 souls wandering through a city built for 1 million. Imagine the silence. Imagine walking through the Forum, past the temples and basilicas, and seeing only weeds growing between the paving stones. The aqueducts that once brought fresh water from the mountains had been cut by invading armies. The great public baths stood empty, their furnaces cold. The apartment blocks that once housed the urban poor were crumbling, their inhabitants fled or dead. This was not metaphorical decline. This was physical, visceral, undeniable collapse. The plagues were apocalyptic. In 541, the plague of Justinian struck the Eastern Empire with a ferocity that would not be matched until the Black Death, 8 centuries later. It arrived on ships from Egypt, carried by rats, spread by fleas. Constantinople, the great capital of the Eastern Roman world, lost perhaps 40% of its population in a matter of months. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill and nearly died. Bodies piled in the streets faster than they could be buried. Mass graves were dug outside the city walls. The stench of death hung over the metropolis for years. And this was not a one-time catastrophe. The plague returned in waves again and again for the next 2 centuries, each time culling the population, each time disrupting trade and agriculture, each time weakening the fabric of civilization. The lost age of Rome was an age of mass death on a scale we can barely comprehend. And yet, even in the midst of this biological apocalypse, someone was building Hagia Sophia. Let that sink in. In 532, just 9 years before the plague arrived, Justinian commissioned the construction of the greatest church in Christendom. 10,000 workers labored for 5 years to raise a dome that seemed to float on light itself. The architects, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, were not merely builders. They were mathematicians, engineers, visionaries, who calculated the stresses and forces required to suspend 40 tons of brick and mortar over an open space that had never been spanned before. When the dome was completed, Justinian reportedly entered the church and whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." This was not the statement of a man presiding over decline. This was the statement of a man who believed he was building for eternity. And in a sense, he was right. Hagia Sophia still stands today, 15 centuries later, a monument to the ambition of an age we call lost. The barbarians themselves defy our stereotypes. We imagine them as savage destroyers, illiterate warriors, who burned libraries and smashed statues. Some of them were, but many of them were something far more interesting. They were admirers of Rome, imitators of Rome, men who wanted to become Roman even as they dismantled the Roman state. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, ruled Italy from 493 to 526. He was an Arian Christian, technically a heretic in the eyes of the Catholic Church, and yet he preserved Roman institutions with remarkable fidelity. He maintained the Senate. He appointed Roman aristocrats to high office. He repaired the aqueducts and public buildings of Rome and Ravenna. He patronized scholars like Boethius and Cassiodorus, men who would preserve classical learning for future generations. When Theodoric died, he was buried in a mausoleum in Ravenna that still stands, a massive structure of Istrian stone that speaks to his ambition to be remembered as a Roman emperor in all but name. The barbarian king was more Roman than the Romans. This is the pattern that repeats throughout the Lost Age. Destruction and preservation intertwined. The Vandals, who sacked Rome in 455, were more thorough than Alaric had been, stripping the city of treasures that had accumulated over centuries. They carried off the golden menorah from the Temple of Jerusalem, which Titus had brought to Rome 4 centuries earlier. They took the bronze roof tiles from the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. They enslaved thousands. And yet the Vandal kingdom in North Africa that followed was not a wasteland of barbarism. It was a functioning state with a literate aristocracy, a legal system, a church hierarchy. The Vandals adopted Latin as their administrative language. They maintained the Roman tax system. They built churches and palaces. When Justinian reconquered North Africa in 533, he found not a desert of ignorance, but a functioning society that had preserved much of Roman civilization, even as it had transformed it. The monasteries were the arks of the flood. While cities shrank and trade routes collapsed, while the infrastructure of classical civilization crumbled, small communities of men and women withdrew from the world to pray and work and copy manuscripts. Benedict of Nursia, writing his rule around 530, created a template for monastic life that would spread across Europe. The Benedictine monasteries became islands of literacy in a sea of illiteracy, repositories of classical texts that would otherwise have been lost forever. A monk in an Irish monastery, copying a Latin grammar by candlelight, was performing an act of cultural preservation more significant than any military victory. The lost age of Rome was not an age when learning died. It was an age when learning went underground, retreated into fortified communities, waited for better times. And those better times would come, centuries later, when the manuscripts preserved in those monasteries would spark the Carolingian Renaissance and eventually the Italian Renaissance. The thread was never broken. It was merely hidden. Consider the transformation of the Roman aristocracy. In the 5th and 6th centuries, the great families of Rome faced a choice. They could cling to the old ways, maintain their villas and their estates, pretend that nothing had changed. Or they could adapt. Many chose adaptation. They entered the church, bringing their education, their administrative skills, their networks of patronage into the service of a new institution. Gregory the Great, Pope from 590 to 604, was born into one of the wealthiest senatorial families of Rome. He could have lived a life of comfortable obscurity, managing his estates, reading his Cicero. Instead, he sold his properties, founded monasteries, and eventually became the most powerful churchman in the Western world. He negotiated with Lombard kings, organized the defense of Rome, reformed the liturgy, sent missionaries to England. The Roman aristocracy did not disappear. It transformed. The skills that had once administered an empire were now deployed in the service of the Church. The lost age of Rome was an age of institutional metamorphosis. The Eastern Empire, what we now call Byzantium, presents its own paradox. It was Rome. The people who lived in Constantinople called themselves Romans, spoke Greek, and traced their political lineage directly to Augustus. And yet it was also something new, something that would have been unrecognizable to a senator of the Republic. The emperor was not merely a political leader, but a sacred figure, God's representative on earth, surrounded by elaborate court rituals borrowed from Persia. The theological disputes that consumed Byzantine politics, arguments about the nature of Christ that seem arcane to modern ears, were matters of life and death, capable of sparking riots and civil wars. The lost age of Rome in the East was an age of intense religious creativity, of councils and creeds, of saints and heretics. It produced icons of haunting beauty and theological treatises of staggering complexity. It was not a decline from classical civilization. It was a different civilization entirely, one that would endure for another 1,000 years, while the West fragmented and reformed. The economy of the Lost Age tells a story of contraction and adaptation. The vast trade networks that had once linked Britain to Egypt, Spain to Syria, began to fray. The great pottery factories of North Africa, which had supplied cheap tableware to the entire Mediterranean world, fell silent. The silver mines of Spain produced less and less. Coinage became scarcer, and in many regions the economy reverted to barter. And yet trade never ceased entirely. Merchants still sailed the Mediterranean, carrying grain and oil and wine. Luxury goods still flowed along the old routes, though in smaller quantities. The economy shrank, but it did not die, and in some regions new patterns of production emerged. The great estates of Gaul, no longer able to export their surplus to distant markets, became more self-sufficient, producing for local consumption. The seeds of the medieval manor system were being planted in the ruins of the Roman villa economy. Decline and innovation, destruction and creation, always intertwined. The military transformation was equally complex. The Roman legions, those disciplined formations of citizen soldiers that had conquered the Mediterranean world, had long since disappeared. By the 5th century, the Roman army was a patchwork of barbarian federates, Germanic warriors, who fought for Rome in exchange for land and gold. The distinction between Roman and barbarian had become hopelessly blurred. Stilicho, the greatest general of the early 5th century, was himself half Vandal. Aetius, who defeated Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451, had spent his youth as a hostage among the Huns and commanded an army that was largely barbarian in composition. The Roman army did not fall to the barbarians. It became the barbarians. This was not a catastrophic collapse, but a gradual transformation, a blurring of boundaries that eventually made the old categories meaningless. When Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor in 476, he was not destroying Rome. He was simply acknowledging a reality that had been developing for generations. The date 476 itself is a construction, a convenient marker invented by later historians who needed a clear endpoint for their narratives. At the time, it passed almost unnoticed. Odoacer sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople and ruled Italy as a barbarian king under nominal Eastern suzerainty. Life went on. The Senate still met. The chariot races still ran in the Circus Maximus. The Pope still celebrated Mass in the great basilicas. The fall of Rome was not a single event, but a process, a gradual transformation that unfolded over centuries. And even that transformation was not a simple decline. It was a redistribution of power, a shift from centralized imperial authority to a patchwork of regional kingdoms, each of which preserved elements of Roman civilization while adapting them to new circumstances. The lost age of Rome was not an ending. It was a transition. The cities of the lost age present a study in contrasts. Rome itself shrank dramatically, its population huddled in the low-lying areas near the Tiber, while the great hills stood empty. The Forum, once the bustling heart of the world, became a cow pasture. And yet other cities flourished. Ravenna, protected by its marshes, became the capital of the Western Empire in its final decades, and then the seat of Ostrogothic and Byzantine power. Its churches, decorated with mosaics of breathtaking beauty, still stand as testimony to the wealth and ambition of the lost age. Constantinople grew and grew, becoming the largest city in the Christian world, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 souls, at a time when Rome had shrunk to a fraction of that. The lost age was not an age of universal urban decline. It was an age of urban redistribution, of new centers rising as old ones fell. The intellectual life of the lost age was richer than we imagine. Boethius, writing his Consolation of Philosophy in a prison cell while awaiting execution, produced a work that would be read and cherished for 1,000 years. He was translating Aristotle, preserving Greek philosophy for a Latin-speaking world that was losing its Greek. Cassiodorus, his contemporary, founded a monastery dedicated to the preservation of learning, establishing a scriptorium where monks copied classical texts alongside Christian scriptures. Isidore of Seville, writing in the 7th century, compiled an encyclopedia that attempted to summarize all human knowledge, from grammar to astronomy to the nature of God. These were not the works of men living in an age of ignorance. These were the works of men who knew that their world was changing and who labored to preserve what they could for future generations. The lost age of Rome was an age of desperate, heroic, intellectual preservation. The art of the lost age defies our expectations. We think of classical art as naturalistic, proportional, idealized. We think of medieval art as flat, stylized, symbolic. The lost age was the bridge between these two traditions, and the art it produced was neither one nor the other. The mosaics of Ravenna, created in the 5th and 6th centuries, show figures with enormous eyes and elongated bodies, their faces frozen in expressions of otherworldly intensity. They are not trying to represent the physical world. They are trying to represent the spiritual world, to make visible the invisible. This was not a decline in artistic skill. It was a transformation in artistic purpose. The artists of the Lost Age were not worse than their classical predecessors. They were doing something different. They were creating a visual language for a new civilization, a civilization that valued transcendence over imitation, eternity over the fleeting moment. The transformation of the landscape itself tells a story. The great Roman roads, those engineering marvels that had bound the empire together, began to fall into disrepair. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system that had allowed messages to travel from Britain to Syria in a matter of weeks, ceased to function. Travel became slower, more dangerous, more local. And yet, the roads did not disappear entirely. They continued to be used, even as they crumbled, providing the skeleton for medieval trade routes and pilgrimage paths. The landscape of the Lost Age was a palimpsest, Roman infrastructure overlaid with new patterns of settlement and cultivation. The great villas of the countryside were abandoned or transformed into fortified strongholds. New villages grew up around churches and monasteries. The human geography of Europe was being rewritten, and the Lost Age was the period of revision. The Church emerged from the Lost Age as the dominant institution of Western civilization. This was not inevitable. In the 4th century, the Church was one institution among many, dependent on imperial patronage, riven by theological disputes. By the 7th century, it was the primary source of literacy, the keeper of records, the arbiter of morality, the provider of social services. The bishops of the Lost Age stepped into the vacuum left by the collapse of imperial administration. They negotiated with barbarian kings, organized the defense of cities, distributed food to the hungry. Gregory the Great, whom we have already met, was as much a political leader as a spiritual one. The papacy that would dominate medieval Europe was forged in the crucible of the Lost Age, shaped by the necessities of a world without effective secular government. The Church did not simply survive the fall of Rome. It was transformed by it, emerging stronger and more central than it had ever been before. The Lost Age also saw the birth of new peoples, new identities, new nations. The Franks, the Visigoths, the Lombards, the Anglo-Saxons. These were not ancient tribes with timeless identities. They were new formations, coalitions of warriors and their followers who coalesced in the chaos of the Lost Age. The Franks who conquered Gaul in the 5th and 6th centuries were not the same people who had raided the Rhine frontier in the 3rd century. They were a new creation, a fusion of Germanic warriors and Gallo-Roman aristocrats, speaking a language that would eventually become French. The Lost Age was an age of ethnogenesis, of the creation of the peoples who would dominate medieval Europe. The nations we know today, France, England, Spain, Italy, Germany, all have their roots in the transformations of the Lost Age. This was not an age of destruction. It was an age of creation. And what of the common people, the farmers and artisans and laborers who made up the vast majority of the population? Their lives are harder to trace, their voices rarely recorded in the sources that survive. But we can glimpse them in the archaeological record, in the bones and pottery and tools they left behind. Their lives were harder than those of their ancestors under the High Empire. They lived shorter lives, ate less meat, wore coarser clothing. The great public amenities of Roman civilization, the baths and theaters and games, were no longer available to them. And yet they adapted. They formed new communities, developed new agricultural techniques, created new forms of social organization. The peasant villages of medieval Europe, with their open fields and common lands and parish churches, were taking shape in the Lost Age. The common people were not merely victims of decline. They were active participants in the creation of a new world. The Lost Age of Rome was an age of violence, of plague, of economic contraction, of political fragmentation. All of this is true, but it was also an age of extraordinary creativity, of intellectual achievement, of artistic innovation, of institutional transformation. It was the age that preserved classical learning for future generations, that created the Church as we know it, that forged the nations of medieval Europe, that developed new forms of art and architecture and philosophy. It was not a gap between two civilizations. It was a bridge, a transition, a metamorphosis. The caterpillar was becoming a butterfly, and the process was painful and messy and beautiful all at once. If you are listening to me now, in the small hours of the night, you understand this. You live in your own age of transformation, your own time of endings and beginnings. The certainties of the past are crumbling. New technologies, new social forms, new ways of being human are emerging. You feel the ground shifting beneath your feet. And perhaps that is why the Lost Age of Rome speaks to you. Not because it offers easy lessons or simple parallels, but because it reminds you that transformation is possible, that endings are also beginnings, that the darkness before dawn is not the same as eternal night. The people of the Lost Age did not know they were living in a transition. They thought they were living in the end of the world. And in a sense they were. Their world was ending. But another world was being born, and they were its midwives, whether they knew it or not. I am the night historian, your faithful companion for these hours of wakefulness. I do not offer you the comfort of simple stories, of clear heroes and villains, of neat beginnings and endings. I offer you the truth, which is always more complicated, always more paradoxical, always more beautiful and terrible than the stories we tell ourselves. The Lost Age of Rome was not lost. It was hidden, waiting to be rediscovered by those willing to look beyond the clichés and the textbook summaries. It was an age of shadow and light, of death and birth, of destruction and creation. It was, in other words, an age like any other, an age like our own. And in recognizing that, perhaps we can find not comfort, but courage. The courage to live in our own time of transformation, to be midwives to whatever world is being born, to keep faith with the future, even when the present seems dark. The night is long, but it is not forever. And somewhere, even now, someone is copying a manuscript, building a church, writing a philosophy, keeping the flame alive for generations yet unborn. That is the lesson of the Lost Age. That is the gift it offers to those who listen in the darkness. Sleep well, night wanderer. We will meet again.